Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Harbor's Advanced TAR series. Gonna let Justin kick this off. Justin?
Yep, welcome back, everybody. Today, yep, just going straight into it. All right. Today we'll be doing the Tara Part 1. So we're going to do a bit of a overview of a lot of the sections we have previously covered, as well as some new information. So a lot of this we'll have already kind of discussed, but this is going to be a kind of more combined front of everything, so we can get a kind of better understanding of how it flows. So in terms of flow, what I'm talking about here is this is straight out of ISO 21434. We have kind of the way that the tar process works, and then kind of where tar fits, but then the actual tar itself is kind of completed in these steps, right? So we have the asset identification, threat scenario identification, impact rating, attack path analysis, and then down to attack feasibility, risk value determination, and a risk treatment decision. So we're going to start today on talking kind of about this first half from assets to attack paths. Let's get right into it, talking about assets. So asset identification, these are assets are going to be objects that have a value or they contribute to the value, right, of the product to stakeholders. And we want to try to identify these. So we must determine the context and composition of the product as the functions, data, interfaces, hardware, software, or networks. All this is saying is look at the feature that we're going to be creating a TAR for or the whole vehicle and look at what parts there might be attacks on, and then kind of how that might end up being a damage scenario, and determine off of that kind of what you would determine to be an asset that has value if compromised. So we also want to identify the cybersecurity properties whose compromise leads to damage scenarios, as I just kind of mentioned there. We want to do identification on the assets, and we want to base this on analyzing the item definition, performing a impact rating, then also deriving assets from threat scenarios, as well as using predefined catalogs. So we're also going to discuss here in a little bit kind of the what, right? That's what the asset is. The why, so a property, kind of what type of asset it is. Or I guess not the what, that's the asset itself, right? Kind of the why the asset exists and how it functions, what its purposes are. And then lastly, we want to look at the location, so kind of where in the TCP/IP stack or kind of communication layer it's at, and what kind of attacks might be feasible for that location. So an example here, a asset would be data communication of the breaking function. And then a property of cybersecurity for that might be a integrity attack could be feasible against it. And then a damage scenario on that asset using the integrity property of it would be collision with vehicle, rear end collision caused by unintended full braking when the vehicle was traveling at high speed, right? So we could see perhaps a uh, message was being messed with here that the integrity property of the braking function was compromised, right? And somebody was able to perform this form of an attack. So here is the kind of the what, right? So the assets that are under consideration, as well as the state that uh, the information is in, and kind of what type of attacks might be feasible there. So at rest is going to be data that's in a stored form. In motion is data that is in transit. In use is going to be data that is being manipulated in the processor. So looking at the list here, we can kind of see how things align. This also lets us know kind of the types of attacks that might be feasible. So for something that is at rest, like logs, perhaps an attack is going to be getting in to the ECU and pulling out that data, right? Because it's not being moved anywhere, you have to go in and get it. For packets, on the other hand, they contain information and are already being moved. So perhaps an attack there is rather than going all the way to the ECU, but trying to rather intercept the packet and get information that way. Then for memory, it's not sitting there, it's not being moved, but it's currently moving inside the processor. So perhaps we want to try and mess with the memory to have some other function occur than what should. Now into the why. this is going to be the CIA triad as well as some other types of attacks that might be possible, or kind of properties, right? that an asset might have that we would want to try and keep as secure as possible. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is disclosure of information. Integrity is going to be data accuracy and completeness. Availability, on-demand access to resources. Non-repudiation, denial of action taken, or failure to acknowledge a request. Authenticity is the entity identity. Accountability is going to be in the system state history. And authorization is kind of the privilege of it. So then we also have the layers to consider. Where is the asset located in accordance to TCP/IP? We have the physical or hardware interface. We have the network, which is the system-mediated transport, as well as the protocol. So what type of protocol the data is being transported in, and then the application, which is handling within the executables. So a little bit more about the CIA triad, as it is very important in both TARAs and just cybersecurity in general, right? We have the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They are the core principles of security, and the threat analysis is also based on the CAA model. So to kind of go over them a little bit deeper here, confidentiality is going to ensure appropriate access levels for sensitive information. So pretty much confidentiality means privacy. People shouldn't have access to things that they should not have access to. For instance, we want a person to have their login information be able to be used to sign into perhaps an app, say Spotify or something. Normally they'll go through your phone, but let's say it's in the car and you have to sign into it each time, which again, we know this wouldn't really work this way. And perhaps that data is stored locally, which again, doesn't work this way, but for the sake of the, sake of the example here. So let's say that there's like a little database on the ECU. We would want somebody to have information there that only they have access to by using their login to get to. We would not want somebody who is able to get into that ECU, look at those logs, and do that themselves, right? So that'd be kind of a breach of privacy on the user. So we would want to do some kind of protections against privilege escalations, acting like the user, or things like that to kind of prevent against it. Then for integrity, we have protection from data modification, alteration, deletion by unauthorized parties. So what this means is accuracy. So if we go off that same example of the logs with user credentials, perhaps the password is changed or the user is completely deleted. Something like that is going to be a integrity issue. So something is being changed, deleted, or like altered in some way, right? And then availability, the most kind of easy to understand one. Availability means it's available. We want to ensure access is available when it is needed. So for the breaking function example, of course, that example back there was talking about unintended breaking. But what we would want to say here is that we want the brakes to be available when they're needed. When somebody presses the brake, it breaks, right? So pretty important stuff there. So now let's get into the threat scenario identification portion. So now that we know what assets are, we've kind of figured out which ones we want to look at. We can figure out how they might lead to damage scenarios. So with these threat modelings, we are going to do a step-by-step procedure to identify threats and vulnerabilities. So again, kind of the flow here is we want to identify the assets. We then want to create a architectural overview, including data flows and as much other information as you can gather. And then also the next step is going to be kind of identifying those threats, vulnerabilities, and requirements that they need to adhere to. So kind of going further with the architectural overview. So not just data flows, we want the individual messages, and we need to know kind of what they're able to perform with those messages. That way we can tell what type of attacks might be feasible by simply spoofing a message, for instance, right? So all this stuff you would want to try and include if possible, as well as how they're accessed. So the type of protocol being used, whether it be Bluetooth, CAN, or Wi-Fi or something like that. And these threat models, they can consist of these different levels. They could be within the component itself. It could be a feature or a subsystem, or it could be the entire vehicle. So we want to do some analyzing and measuring of the severity of the impact of that threat on the TOE, which is the target of evaluation. So what this is saying is if we have a threat model or a threat that we believe might be feasible on a vehicle, we want to attach that to a damage scenario and see kind of how impactful that would be on the road user. And lastly, we want to define some security objectives using the CIA triad. And there are two main ways of performing threat modeling. It is the attack tree and the stride methodology. So down here at the bottom, you can kind of see again how we would go from damage scenario to cybersecurity requirements, right? So we're going to start with that damage scenario, kind of come up with what might happen in the worst case, just looking at how a feature works, then seeing what happens if it isn't working, if it's working the opposite of what you would imagine, or any case there in between. Then we would create the threats that kind of lead to that, and then come up with the risk assessment to see, okay, how feasible is it? How risky is it actually? And then from there, we know kind of what areas we want to protect against the most. And then we can create those cybersecurity requirements to try and protect against those types of attacks. So let's first look at the attack tree methodology. So first we want to look at, again, kind of the vehicle's attack surface. So we figured out what assets we want to protect against, but we want to see how much somebody actually get in there. So going from the kind of top-down approach, we have the engineering and supply base. So this is before a vehicle is even fully completed. We have the vehicle component software and hardware, as well as the entire manufacturing line. If some attack is performed at the plant that says to put in a different ECU than what should be put in there, of course you would imagine it would fail some tests down the line, but perhaps it doesn't, and some faulty ECU is being sent around, or it has been flashed wrong before even being put into a car. Then all the vehicles that have kind of that time frame of ECU, right, might have some externally executable commands or control that might be able to be done to it. So big area to kind of consider there, but one that's not generally looked at. Now we also have a kind of remote attack surface. So this is going to be connected vehicle server infrastructure. So a lot of backend servers are going to be kind of in this area. And then the diagnostics and updates. So a lot of vehicles are trying to send their data kind of to the back end again to keep track of how the vehicle is doing and let the OEMs give them kind of a, hey, heads up, you have X and Y going on. You might want to get that checked out, right? Or again, to kind of flash those ECUs with new updates. And then proximity, we do have one in here that can also be remote, and that's going to be the mobile application. A lot of vehicles are now having mobile application access as well to possibly lock and unlock the vehicle, drive it to you, or something as simple as remote starting it or unlocking it all from your phone. So that might be something that's done remotely, but you can also use it in proximity. Sometimes there's some Bluetooth capability there to unlock your vehicle from a kind of closer distance, or using it kind of as a separate key. And then we also have RF GPS, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, cellular, vehicle to anything else, so V2X, and sensor. So any of these types of kind of attack surfaces can be used to try and mess with the vehicle, especially when you're looking at it holistically. So specific features may have some functionalities while not having others, but most of them will have the local attack surface if nothing else. They will have some form of CAN bus communications, or automotive Ethernet, or LIN, MOST, or USB access to it. So that's going to be kind of the main area to kind of need to know how things are going. And then we can also use the local communication and see if there's any way to send those specific messages via one of these other types of less local attack surfaces as well. So we do also have the attack tree methodology, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. So this is going to be a slightly more quantitative approach. and it gives us a graphical representation of attack possibilities with a tree structure. So at the root of the tree is the security goal, kind of at the top here. So headlamp integrity and availability is maintained, and it helps to determine which action should be prevented. So first you want to identify the possible attack goals, and then think of all the attacks that might be possible to reach that same goal, then add them all to the tree. And that is going to then you perform kind of validation on those attack paths and see which is going to be the most kind of feasible attack path. So out of all of these, perhaps a malicious signal spoof to turn off a lamp is going to be the most feasible, but it can only be done locally. So while it might be the most feasible, you have to consider the other kind of aspects of it, right? So the window of opportunity there would be kind of lower. So that's something that would be considered when looking at the feasibility. So again, got to pick the kind of most important one, but you do want to list all of them. So here's kind of a breakdown again of how it works. So we have the attack objective. So this is going to be kind of the severity. So you have a threat scenario and a damage scenario associated with it that has some level of impact and severity. And then down here, you have the actual attack path. And this has got to do with the feasibility. So how likely is it actually to occur? And from that, the impact and feasibility, we're able to determine risk. Talking about risk, we also have the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. It has 3 metric groups, the base, temporal, and environmental metric groups. And feasibility here is going to be determined on the exploitability metrics out of ISO 21434, those being the attack vector, attack complexity, privileges required, and user interaction. Now onto what Block Harbor generally uses to perform its TARs. This is going to be the STRIDE methodology. This is a slightly more qualitative threat analysis method, and it focuses on the spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation privilege. So we want to look at how an attack might be performed using one of these kind of avenues, right? So we want to kind of, instead of using every type of attack possibility, we look at the kind of most common and kind of holistic types of attacks and listen those 6 categories. And we use it because it is very repeatable. The efficiency and effectiveness is based on a known design. It's relatively easy to document versus the attack tree, which gets very kind of convoluted and large kind of very easily. And then controls can be directly associated with identified vulnerabilities as well. So here's a couple examples of kind of the STRIDE threats on an asset. I'm not going to read through all of these. You can kind of pause and look at it if you want, but one of the examples here is going to be tampering, for instance. A tampering threat might be on a ECU software where somebody messes with the software itself by reflashing it or otherwise, but this might let a attacker change the data that's stored or in transit, and it may change the functionality of the object, right? And that's going to be, if we're looking at changing or altering data, obviously that's going to then go into the CIA triad of integrity. And of course, the other ones also have kind of that same flow of, all right, here we have the threat, information disclosure, and if this is on data, since things are being shared that shouldn't be, that's confidentiality, right? CIA triad again. Now we can get into the impact ratings. So a damage scenario, first off, of course, we've talked about it a little bit, but what exactly is it? This is going to be an adverse consequence involving a vehicle or vehicle function and affecting a road user. Then the impact is going to be an estimate of the magnitude of damage or physical harm from a damage scenario. So what this is really saying is what bad things might happen if some attack were to occur, and then how bad is it, right? So the estimate of damage, here it says, or physical harm from a damage scenario, we do also consider privacy as a part of this. We'll get to that in a little bit here to discuss a little bit more in depth, but it's not purely a physical thing since this is a cybersecurity space, right? We do have kind of confidentiality as an issue. So these damage scenarios shall be identified, which can include a relation between the functionality of the item and the adverse consequence, as well as description of harm to the road user and or relevant assets. So if you would see a system malfunction, what would it look like, right? So look at the feature. If something were to go wrong, what might happen? If a window closing is supposed to have some sort of resistive force that it were to open back up at, uh, perhaps somebody were to create an attack that lets that window continue closing and might damage somebody more than it normally would, right? Something like that would be kind of a damage scenario and a way to think about kind of the worst case possible there. So a real life example we have is of the 2014 Jeep Cherokee hack, where it was able to be controlled remotely. So here we could say that the vehicle could cause a pileup and potentially many deaths and hundreds of thousands in damage, right? So that's going to be kind of safety. There we have the financial aspect of it, but pretty much we, we don't want this to happen, right? So we want to see what type of attack path might be kind of possible to lead to this, and then do everything in our power to stop that from being possible. So again, here's how an example of the damage scenario all the way to mitigations would go. So a scenario of a vulnerability via an API on mobile devices allows an attacker to control any connected fleet of vehicles via an OBDII dongle to connected applications on a mobile device. So what this is saying, right? Pretty much remote control of vehicles via mobile device as long as a specific device is plugged in. So the kind of threat here of what's allowing this to happen would be unauthorized commands on the vehicle. So exploiting an application allowed the attacker to execute commands on the CAN network. And the goal to kind of prevent this, right, would be unauthorized remote access. We want to not allow that. And a requirement for that might be to prevent compromise through encryption. And then the concept that those would kind of adhere to is that secure code reviews would be required after each major version deployment with automated security tests run in parallel. And then a kind of mitigation strategy would be to harden authorization on the mobile application and the cloud backend to prevent unnecessary commands on the CAN. So again, kind of impact analysis here, right? For vehicles, it's not just the vehicle itself, it's kind of the entire vehicle that's affected a lot of times. So we want to look at the severity, the type of damage, as well as what all it is affecting. Whether it be just the person itself, the vehicle, the surroundings, what all is actually being affected. So quick check here. I had kind of mentioned some of them a little bit ago, but we haven't brought it up directly. What do you think are the 4 categories we were looking at when doing an impact analysis? SFOB. So potential adverse consequences for road users in the impact categories of safety, financial, operational, and privacy, respectively. That's what SFOP is, right? So when we're doing a impact analysis, we're going to look at what can potentially break, consider the most impactful occurrence, and then look at kind of the range of 0 to 3 for how it might be affecting the safety, financial, operational, or privacy of the stakeholder or road user. So what this is saying is we've come up with a damage scenario. We have the threat scenarios associated with it. Now, you have to look at how bad actually is that damage scenario, and you want to try and look at the absolute worst case while still staying in the realm of kind of possibility, right? You don't want to say, oh, well, we're able to turn on our blinker without requesting it, so that must mean that we're going to have like a 30-car pileup. Like you can't make those like leaps in judgment there, but you can kind of use your best understanding of how things might happen there to come up with kind of a realistic worst case scenario, and then match those accordingly with the SFOP here. So an example here, we have a damage scenario of vehicle cannot be driven at night because the driver perceives the headlamp function was inhibited while parked. So they're unable to move, or they don't want to because they can't turn their headlights on pretty much. And that is going to be at least a impact on the operationality of the vehicle because they can't turn their lights on right. So this is going to have a major rating. Then a front collision with a narrow stationary object or like a tree might be caused by unintended turning off of headlamp during night driving at medium speeds. So this might be like veering off the road due to not being able to see the road, right? Because your headlights turn off, especially if you're going down like a more country road without other people around you, right? Kind of a really dark environment. This would get a safety rating, of course, of severe, as this would affect definitely affect the road user quite a bit if that were to happen. And another damage scenario example here would be malfunctioning automatic high beam caused by headlamp, always remaining at low beam during night driving. So this is going to be a operational type issue. They are still able to see, but not everything. So rather than being a major issue where it's completely off, it would only be moderate. That is it for part 1. Thank you everybody for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2. Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you as well, Justin. Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to having you all back again. Have a good one.